Welcome to Shadow Theory. In this journey, we'll explore the story of a nation unlike any other. A land shaped by ancient civilizations, revolution, conflict, innovation, and enduring ideals. This is the entire history of the United States of America. From the earliest indigenous cultures, long before Columbus, to the rise of a global superpower in the 21st century. Every chapter holds a story that shaped the world we live in today. We'll break down over 5 centuries of history across 40 chapters, one after another, each designed to help you truly understand how America became what it is today. Whether you're here to learn, reflect, or simply explore the human journey through time, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. Part 1. The Indigenous Peoples of North America. Long before the first European ships reached the shores of North America, long before the idea of the United States ever existed, the land we now call America was home to millions of people, diverse, complex, deeply rooted in the earth. These were the Indigenous Peoples of North America. Their history stretches back thousands of years, shaping the land, the rivers, the forests, and the deserts with rich cultures, powerful traditions, and unique civilizations. Across the vast continent, they developed sophisticated societies, one adapted to its environment. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, once known as the Anasazi, built massive stone cities like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, with intricate roads, astronomy, and water systems. To the east, the Mississippian cultures constructed sprawling cities of earthen mounds, the largest being Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis. At its peak, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. In the woodlands of the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 6 nations, developed democratic governance and decision-making councils that influenced the ideas of future American leaders. Further north and west, nomadic peoples like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche followed the migration of bison across the Great Plains, developing deep spiritual ties to the land and sky. The Pacific Northwest was home to the Tlingit Haida and other coastal cultures who thrived on fishing totem, carving, and complex clan systems, while in the Arctic, the Inuit adapted to frozen landscapes with incredible skill crafting tools, homes, and transportation suited for survival. Far from being primitive or isolated, these societies had trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic coast. Goods like copper, shells, obsidian, and even feathers were traded in complex systems that reveal a continent alive with exchange, connection, and shared knowledge. Each people had their own languages. Over 300 distinct languages were spoken across the continent, along with unique religious beliefs, myths, social systems, and worldviews. For many, the earth was sacred. The rivers, the trees, the animals, all part of a living world of spirit and balance. This rich tapestry of cultures thrived for centuries, evolving over time, adapting to climate changes, internal conflicts, and migrations. But in 1492, everything was about to change. With the arrival of Europeans came disease, conquest, colonization, and the near erasure of countless cultures and traditions. But that is a story for the next chapter. Before that storm, for the Revolution, for the flag, the Constitution, and the United States, there was a continent of nations already here. To understand America, we must first remember what came before. The first Americans. Part 2. European exploration and the Age of Discovery. The late 15th century, the world was shifting. Nations in Europe were growing hungry for wealth, power, and territory. Their ships began to push beyond familiar waters, seeking new trade routes, unknown lands, and untold riches. This was the Age of Discovery. It would change the course of human history forever. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, set foot in the Caribbean. Although he believed he had reached Asia, he had in fact arrived in a part of the world previously unknown to Europeans. This moment would mark the beginning of more than 3 centuries of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Other European powers followed quickly: Spain, Portugal, France, England. and the Netherlands began carving up the New World with little regard for those who already lived there. They saw this land as a prize rich in gold, timber, furs, and fertile soil. The Spanish conquered large parts of Central and South America, but their influence reached into what is now the American Southwest. They established missions, forts, and colonies in places like Florida, New Mexico, Texas, and California. French explorers pushed into the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River. They formed trade alliances with Native American tribes and established settlements in areas that would become Canada and the American Midwest. The French approach relied heavily on fur trading and diplomatic relationships with indigenous nations. The Dutch, meanwhile, set up a colony called New Netherland, centered around what would later become New York City. But it was the English who would come to dominate the eastern seaboard of North America. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in what is now Virginia. It was a harsh beginning, famine, disease, and conflict with indigenous peoples nearly wiped the colony out in its first years. A few years later, in 1620, a group of religious separatists known as the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, fleeing religious persecution in England. They hoped to build a new life in the New World. Their story would become central to American mythology, though the reality was far more complex and often brutal. Over the next century, millions of Europeans crossed the Atlantic, seeking fortune, freedom, or a second chance. But the growth of these colonies came at an enormous cost. European contact brought devastating diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza to native populations. In some regions, over 90% of the indigenous population perished in a matter of decades. The Age of Discovery was not just about maps and trade routes. It was the dawn of a new global system, one built on conquest, exploitation, and resistance. It marked the beginning of what would become the Atlantic slave trade, the violent displacement of native peoples, and the rise of empires fueled by colonial wealth. Still, it laid the foundations for the modern world and for what would eventually become the United States of America. The land was no longer untouched, nor purely indigenous. It was now a continent in conflicted future, shaped by ambition, violence, and hope. As the 17th century progressed, colonies grew, and tensions began to rise between settlers and natives, between nations, and even among the colonies themselves. Part 3. The 13 Colonies. Foundations and Settlements. By the early 1600s, the eastern coast of North America was dotted with small, struggling European settlements. Over time, these outposts grew into colonies, distinct regions with their own economies, cultures, and purposes. Eventually, there would be 13 British colonies, and together, they would form the heart of the future United States. But their beginnings were far from unified. Each colony had a different reason for existing. In the South, colonies like Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia were largely built for economic gain. Wealthy landowners established massive plantations, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. To fuel this system, they relied heavily on indentured servants and increasingly on enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade soon became central to the Southern economy. By the late 1600s, slavery was not just a practice, it was the law. In the North, the story was different. New England colonies, such as Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, were founded mostly by religious dissenters, Puritans, Pilgrims, and others seeking to build societies based on their faith. These communities valued education, self-governance, and hard work. They established schools, churches, and town meetings that became the foundation of early democratic life. To the middle of the map, colonies like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware emerged as a blend commercial hubs with ethnic and religious diversity. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, became a haven for Quakers and other persecuted groups. It promoted tolerance, peace with Native Americans, and representative government. Each colony developed its own charter, leadership, and legal system. And while they were all tied to Britain, they increasingly operated with a sense of independence. Trade flourished. Ports like Boston, New York, and Charleston became vital links in the Atlantic economy. Goods flowed in tea, sugar, textiles, and out tobacco, timber, cotton, and furs. But this prosperity had shadows. Behind the wealth was a growing dependence on slavery, land theft, and conflict with native tribes. As settlers pushed westward, they clashed violently with indigenous nations, sparking a series of wars that would continue for generations. Still, by the early 1700s, the colonies had grown stable and self-sufficient. Each one had its own identity, its own economy, and its own beliefs. But they also shared something else: a growing awareness that they were not just outposts of Europe anymore. They were something new. Though loyal to the British Crown, many colonists began to see themselves as Americans. They were proud of their freedoms, their lands, and their local control. And as British rule grew heavier, tensions began to simmer. The colonies were not yet united, but the seeds of revolution had already been planted. Part 4: Colonial Life, Culture, and Conflicts. To truly understand the American colonies, we have to look beyond the wars, leaders, and founding charters. We need to look at everyday life, because the foundations of the United States were built not just in government halls or on battlefields, but in farms, churches, town squares, and family homes. Life in the colonies was harsh, unpredictable, and deeply shaped by the land. Most people were farmers. They rose with the sun, worked the fields, raised livestock, and depended on the seasons to survive. Homes were simple wooden cabins or brick houses, often shared by large families. In New England, life revolved around the church and town meetings. Puritan values promoted education, literacy, and discipline. Children were taught to read not for entertainment, but to understand the Bible. These northern communities emphasized hard work and self-governance. In the middle colonies, diversity was the defining feature. Settlers from England, Germany, the Netherlands, Scotland, and elsewhere lived side by side. Here, religious tolerance was more common, and cities like Philadelphia became melting pots of ideas, trade, and innovation. In the South, plantation life created a stark contrast. Wealthy, elite-owned massive estates, worked by enslaved Africans whose lives were marked by brutal conditions, forced labor, and violence. Below the elite class were poor white farmers, indentured servants, and the enslaved population that grew with each passing year. Education varied across the colonies. In New England, public schooling was common. The South, education was mostly for the rich. For many, especially enslaved people, education was denied entirely. Women in colonial society had limited rights. They could not vote or hold office, and their roles were largely domestic, raising children, managing homes, and assisting on farms. Yet many women played crucial roles in family businesses, communities, and even underground political activity. Religion was everywhere. Churches dominated town centers, and though each colony had its own dominant denomination, Puritan, Anglican, Quaker, Catholic, there was constant tension over freedom of worship. Conflict wasn't limited to religion. Colonists frequently clashed with Native American nations over land and trade. Wars like King Philip's War in New England and Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia revealed deep divides not just between settlers and indigenous peoples, but also among the colonists themselves. And far from being peaceful outposts, the colonies were sometimes lawless. Crime, duels, political rivalries, and frontier violence created a chaotic and unpredictable world. But over time, communities built systems of order courts, militias, local governments that reflected their unique American character. What began as scattered settlements had grown into a network of thriving, diverse societies. And beneath the surface, pressure was building. British policies, taxes, and restrictions were becoming harder to ignore. And as colonists tasted the fruits of independence in daily life, they began to question their loyalty to the distant British crown. A revolution was not yet inevitable, but the people were changing, and the world around them was changing too. Part 5: The French and Indian War and British Dominance. By the mid-1700s, North America was a battleground, not just for settlers and native nations, but for Europe's most powerful empires. Britain and France were locked in a global rivalry, and their conflict would explode on American soil in a war known as the French and Indian War. It began in 1754, deep in the Ohio River Valley, where both French and British colonists laid claim to the same territory. Native American tribes who had lived on and stewarded the land for centuries were caught in the middle, Some sided with the French, others with the British. Many tried to defend their own independence. One of the first skirmishes of the war was led by a young colonial officer from Virginia. His name was George Washington. Though the war started in America, it quickly expanded into a global conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. Battles were fought across continents from North America to Europe, the Caribbean, and even India. In North America, the war was brutal. Forts changed hands. Settlements were burned. Lives were lost on all sides. But eventually, after nearly a decade of fighting, the British emerged victorious. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. France ceded most of its North American territories to Britain, including Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River. It was a massive win for the British Empire. They now controlled vast portions of the continent. But victory came at a cost. The war had been expensive, deeply expensive. Britain was in debt. And to pay for it, Parliament looked to the colonies. Taxes, duties, trade restrictions. For the first time, British officials began enforcing laws that had long been ignored. The colonists, once proud British subjects, were now being treated like a source of revenue. The war also changed the map hand, the mindset. Colonists had fought and died to help Britain win. Now, many believed they deserved a greater voice in their own affairs. At the same time, Native American nations who had lost their French allies now faced growing pressure from British expansion. Conflict erupted again. In 1763, a massive uprising led by the Ottawa Chief Pontiac challenged British control of the Great Lakes region. The rebellion failed, but it reminded the British just how fragile their new empire was. To calm tensions, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. But for settlers hungry for land, the line meant nothing. They continued pushing west, ignoring royal orders, igniting conflict, and feeding resentment. In the eyes of many colonists, the war had proved something important. They could fight, they could organize, and they no longer needed Britain as much as they once thought. The French and Indian War had redrawn the map, but more importantly, it had reshaped colonial identity. The colonies were growing restless, the empire was tightening its grip, and a revolution was no longer a distant idea. Part 6. Taxation and Rebellion. Seeds of Revolution. The year is 1763. The French and Indian War is over. Britain stands victorious, with control over much of North America. But the empire is drowning in debt. To pay it off, British leaders turn to the colonies. Their reasoning is simple. The colonies benefited from the war, so now they should help pay for it. But to the colonists, this marked the beginning of something far more troubling. It started with the Sugar Act in 1764. It taxed sugar, molasses, and other imported goods. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, requiring that nearly every printed document from newspapers to playing cards carry a paid British stamp. To many colonists, this wasn't just about money, it was about power. For the first time, taxes were being imposed directly by Parliament in London, with no colonial input. This sparked a new rallying cry. No taxation without representation. Protests erupted. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches denounced the British government. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged, using both words and force to oppose the new laws. In cities like Boston, resistance turned fierce. Tax collectors were harassed. Effigies were burned. British goods were boycotted. The colonies were uniting not yet for independence, but in shared anger. Under pressure, the British repealed the Stamp Act, but they soon introduced the Townshend Acts, taxing everyday items like glass, paint, and tea. Tensions only grew. In 1770, British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists in Boston. 5 men were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. And though the truth was more complex than the legend, it didn't matter. For many colonists, the image was clear. The British were now oppressors, and blood had been shed. In response, resistance spread. Colonial newspapers fanned the flames. Committees of correspondence were formed to coordinate across the colonies. And in 1773, the most iconic protest yet took place. On a cold December night, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the sea. The act became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with fury. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor, revoked local self-government, and sent more troops to enforce British rule. But the punishment only united the colonies further. Representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. They formed the First Continental Congress, a powerful step toward unity and eventual independence. Colonies were no longer loyal children of the crown. They were angry, organized, and on the edge of rebellion. Still, many hoped for peace. Petitions were sent. Compromises were proposed. But behind the scenes, militias were forming. Muskets were being cleaned. And somewhere in the hills of New England, the first shots of revolution were growing closer. Part 7. The American Revolution begins. By early 1775, the American colonies stood on the edge of war. British rule was no longer just unpopular, it was intolerable. Tensions had boiled over, and violence was no longer a question of if, but when. The British had sent more troops to enforce order, especially in rebellious Massachusetts. Meanwhile, colonial militias were training, storing weapons, and preparing for what many now believed was inevitable. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston toward the town of Concord, aiming to seize a cache of colonial weapons. But in Lexington, they were met by a small band of colonial militia. No one knows who fired the first shot. But once it rang out, everything changed. It became known as the shot heard round the world. The British pushed forward to Concord, but colonial fighters ambushed them on the return. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The American Revolution had begun. Almost overnight, the colonies erupted in armed resistance, militias now calling themselves Minutemen mobilized across New England. Forts were seized, roads were blocked, and in May, the Second Continental Congress met again in Philadelphia. Though still divided over full independence, the Congress took bold action. They appointed George Washington, a Virginian planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Soon after, American forces surrounded the British in Boston. In June, they clashed at Bunker Hill. It was a costly British victory, but it proved that colonial fighters could stand against the might of the British Empire. Back in Britain, King George III declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. He rejected petitions for peace and sent even more troops and warships across the Atlantic. The colonies, once proud to call themselves British, now began to question everything. Why stay loyal to a king who dismissed their voices? Why obey a government that ruled them by force? In early 1776, a new voice emerged, a radical pamphlet titled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. It argued not just against taxation, but against monarchy itself. It called for full independence, clearly, boldly, and in everyday language that anyone could understand. Common sense spread like wildfire. It electrified the colonies and shifted public opinion toward revolution. By summer, the Second Continental Congress was ready. On July 2, 1776, the delegates voted for independence, and 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted one of the most famous documents in human history, the Declaration of Independence. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson and signed by men who knew they were committing treason against the crown. It declared that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of those ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. With ink on parchment, the United States of America was born. But names and declarations weren't enough. Now they had to fight for it. The most powerful empire on earth was coming to crush the rebellion, and the revolution was only just beginning. Part 8. Declaration of Independence and Revolutionary War. In July 1776, the United States of America declared itself free, but that freedom was not yet real. The war for independence had only just begun, and the odds were stacked against the colonies. The British Empire was the most powerful military force on the planet. It had trained soldiers, a massive navy, global resources, and experience. The colonies had a fledgling army, little money, no formal allies, and no real navy to speak of. But they had determination, they had a cause, and they had George Washington. The months after the Declaration, British forces launched a massive assault on New York City. Tens of thousands of redcoats, supported by warships, overwhelmed American defenses. Washington's army was defeated, forced to retreat across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. At times, it seemed like the revolution might collapse. But Washington struck back. On Christmas night, 1776, he led a daring surprise attack across the icy Delaware River, defeating Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was a small victory, but a vital one. It gave hope. Still, the early years of the war were filled with struggle. There were defeats, shortages of food and weapons, and internal divisions. Some colonists, known as Loyalists, remained loyal to Britain, and civil conflict broke out in many areas. But slowly the tide began to shift. In 1777, American forces won a decisive victory at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. This victory convinced France, Britain's longtime rival, to openly join the war on the American side. In 1778, the French signed an alliance with the United States. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic joined in too. The war was global. British resources were stretched thin, and the Americans had support in the form of ships, troops, weapons, and money. Washington's army endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. In 1777 to 78, thousands suffered from cold, hunger, and disease. But they trained, learned discipline, and emerged stronger thanks, in part, to Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled the Continental Army into shape. Meanwhile, the British strategy shifted. They moved south, hoping to rally Loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. At first, they succeeded capturing Savannah and Charleston. But guerrilla warfare, local resistance, and battlefield defeats gradually wore them down. By 1781, the war reached its climax. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, hoping for resupply from the British Navy. But the French fleet blocked the harbor. Washington and French forces marched south and laid siege to Yorktown. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. It was the final major battle of the war. The fighting would continue in scattered places for 2 more years, but Yorktown broke Britain's will to continue. Peace negotiations began, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. The war was over. After 8 long years of struggle, the impossible had been achieved. A collection of colonies had defied an empire and won, but victory brought new questions. How would this new country be governed? What would freedom mean? How could 13 very different states come together as one? Part 9. Victory and Treaty of Paris. The battlefield at Yorktown was quiet now. British General Cornwallis had surrendered. The cheers of American and French soldiers echoed through the fields. But though the fighting had ended, the war was not officially over. In the aftermath of Yorktown in October 1781, the British government faced intense pressure. The cost of the war, the global alliances against them, and the defeat in America all combined to make peace the only option. It would take 2 long years of negotiation. While the guns fell silent, diplomats went to work. In Paris, representatives from the United States, Britain, France, and Spain gathered to shape the future of North America. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Guthrie Sharp Mines, with one goal: secure a lasting, favorable peace. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The treaty recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation. It established boundaries from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. Britain also agreed to withdraw all troops from American soil. In return, the United States pledged to respect the rights and property of Loyalists, those who had remained loyal to the British Crown. But in reality, many Loyalists faced harassment, property loss, or exile. Tens of thousands fled to Canada or returned to Britain. The war had left deep scars. The economy was shattered. Farms and cities had been burned. Trade had collapsed. Inflation soared, and the new nation owed millions in war debts. The Continental Army was disbanded, and many soldiers returned home without pay. There was no strong central government, just the Articles of Confederation, a fragile agreement between the 13 states. And yet, in spite of the uncertainty, there was a deep sense of possibility. For the first time in modern history, a colony had successfully broken free from its empire and formed an independent republic. The American experiment had begun. But it wouldn't be easy. The states were divided by geography, by economy, by ideology. Some feared a return to tyranny. Others feared anarchy. The challenge now was not to win a war but to build a nation. Part 10. The Articles of Confederation and Constitutional Convention. In 1783, the War for Independence was over. But the hard part was just beginning. The United States of America was now free, but also fragile. 13 former colonies, each with their own governments, economies, and identities, were trying to function as one nation. Their first attempt at unity came in the form of a document called the Articles of Confederation. Ratified in 1781, the Articles created a loose alliance, not a strong federal government. Congress could make laws, but it couldn't enforce them. It could declare war, but it couldn't raise a national army. And while it could borrow money, it had no power to tax. Each state had one vote, regardless of size or population. There was no precedent, no national court system, and no real way to resolve disputes between states. First, this system seemed like a safeguard against tyranny. Americans had just fought a war to escape an all-powerful government. Now, they wanted the exact opposite. But within a few years, cracks began to show. States printed their own money, often leading to inflation and confusion. Trade between states became difficult. Some states raised tariffs against their neighbors. Debt grew. Public confidence fell. In 1786, unrest exploded in Massachusetts. A group of poor farmers, led by Daniel Shays, launched an armed uprising to protest high taxes and foreclosures. They called it a defense of their rights. Shays' rebellion was quickly suppressed, but it shook the nation. If the federal government couldn't stop a small rebellion, could it survive a larger crisis? More and more leaders began to believe that the Articles weren't working. Something stronger was needed. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia. Their original goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation. But soon, they realized the Articles couldn't be fixed. A new system had to be created. For 4 hot summer months, in secret meetings behind closed doors, they debated. The result would become the United States Constitution. The debates were intense. Big states versus small states. Northern states versus southern states. How much power should the central government have? How should representation work? Out of compromise came innovation. The delegates created a 3-branch system: legislative, executive, and judicial. They formed a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, with equal representation for every state. They included a president to enforce laws and a Supreme Court to interpret them. Power was carefully balanced between the federal government and the states, between large states and small, between branches of government. But there were also limits. The Constitution did not abolish slavery. It did not grant equal rights to women, indigenous peoples, or enslaved Africans. These issues were left unresolved problems for future generations. In September 1787, the Constitution was signed, but it would not take effect until ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The debates spilled into public life. Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, argued for the new Constitution. Anti-Federalists feared it gave too much power to the central government. To win support, the Federalists promised a series of amendments, a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. By 1789, the Constitution was ratified, and George Washington was elected as the first President of the United States. A new chapter had begun. The Revolution had created independence. Now the Constitution would define what that independence meant. Part 11. Birth of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was signed in 1787, but it wasn't yet a government. It was an idea, promise, a structure waiting to come alive. In 1789, that moment came. George Washington, the hero of the Revolutionary War, was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He took the oath of office in New York City, the temporary capital, and with him began the real work of building a nation. The Constitution had outlined the framework. Now, it had to be filled in with laws, people, traditions, and institutions. One of the first and most urgent promises made during ratification was to ensure individual rights. Many feared that the new federal government, though limited on paper, could eventually grow to powerful, just like the monarchy they had fought to escape. To calm those fears, James Madison, now a member of the new Congress, drafted a set of amendments. These 10 amendments would become known as the Bill of Rights. Ratified in 1791, it guaranteed basic freedoms that would become cornerstones of American identity: freedom of speech, press, and religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to a fair trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, and the recognition that rights not listed still belong to the people. The Bill of Rights reassured the public, put limits on government, and elevated the role of the individual in the new republic. Meanwhile, the first Congress began shaping the machinery of the federal government. They created departments for war, foreign affairs, finance, and more. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, began crafting an economic system. He pushed for a national bank, federal assumption of state debts, and tariffs to protect American industries. But not everyone agreed. Opposition formed quickly, especially from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who believed Hamilton's vision made the government too strong, too urban, and too aligned with elite interests. Thus, the first political parties emerged. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, who favored a strong central government and close ties to Britain, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, who believed in states' rights, agricultural values, and closer relations with France. Washington, though deeply respected, struggled to hold the country together amid rising divisions. Foreign affairs added to the tension. The French Revolution broke out in 1789, and Americans were split. Some saw it as a continuation of liberty. Others saw only chaos and bloodshed. Washington remained neutral, trying to keep the fragile young nation out of European wars. He served terms at year's end, then did something unheard of for his time. He voluntarily stepped down from power. In 1796, he delivered a powerful farewell address, warning against the dangers of political parties, foreign entanglements, and sectionalism. Washington's presidency had created precedence traditions, not written into law, but followed for generations. 2 terms in office, peaceful transfer of power, civilian leadership over the military, and respect for the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights were no longer abstract documents. They were living tools shaping debate, guiding law, and holding the new republic together. But storm clouds were gathering. In the years ahead, fierce political battles, foreign threats, and internal rebellions would test the strength of the American experiment. Part 12. Washington's Legacy and the Rise of Political Parties. When George Washington left office in 1797, he left behind more than a new government. He left behind a vision, a republic rooted in law, unity, and peaceful leadership. But almost immediately, that vision was tested. Washington's farewell address had warned the nation about 3 dangers: the growth of political parties, long-term foreign alliances, and deep sectional divides between North and South. Each of those warnings would be ignored almost right away. The election of 1796 was the first contested presidential race in American history. It revealed just how deeply the nation had already begun to split. The Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government, support for industry, and closer ties with Britain. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, pushed for states' rights, an agrarian economy, and sympathy for the French Revolution. When the votes were counted, John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, his political rival, became vice president due to the rules at the time. Adams faced an immediate crisis. In France, the revolution had spiraled into violence, and tensions with the U.S. grew. American ships were being seized at sea, and war seemed possible. Adams sent diplomats to negotiate peace, but they were met with demands for bribes, an event that became known as the XYZ Affair. Outraged, Federalists in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, and made it illegal to publicly criticize the government. To many Americans, these acts were a betrayal of the First Amendment. Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The nation was dividing philosophically and politically. Adams, to his credit, avoided war with France by negotiating peace, but his party was weakened. In 1800, the next election proved just how fragile the young democracy still was. It was a bitter campaign. Newspapers attacked both sides. Insults flew. Rumors spread. When the votes were finally counted, Thomas Jefferson had won, but the process was chaotic. Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr received the same number of electoral votes. The decision went to the House of Representatives. For days, the outcome hung in the balance. Finally, after intense lobbying, Jefferson was declared the winner. The election of 1800 is often called the Revolution of 1800, not because of violence, but because power changed hands peacefully between rival political parties for the first time in history. John Adams, despite losing, quietly left the capital and returned home. There were no arrests, no coups, no civil war. In that moment, the United States proved that democracy could work, but political parties were here to stay. And the ideological battle between strong central authority and states' rights would only deepen in the years ahead. Part 13. The Jefferson Era and the Louisiana Purchase. In the year 1801, Thomas Jefferson took office as the third president of the United States. A philosopher, a farmer, and the author of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson believed in a limited government, individual freedoms, and a nation built on agriculture rather than industry. His vision was simple: a republic of small landowners, self-reliant and free. But during his presidency, Jefferson would make one of the boldest moves in American history, a decision that would double the size of the country and reshape its destiny. It all started with land. At the time, the Mississippi River was the lifeline of the American interior. Farmers needed access to New Orleans, where the river met the sea, to trade their crops. That city and the massive territory surrounding it was controlled by France. Jefferson sent diplomats to buy New Orleans, but France had a surprising offer. For just $15 million, the United States could purchase the entire Louisiana territory, more than 800,000 square miles of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had lost interest in North America and needed money for war in Europe. The offer was too good to refuse. In 1803, Jefferson approved the Louisiana Purchase, instantly doubling the size of the United States. It was a constitutional gamble. The Constitution didn't say a president could buy land, but Jefferson reasoned that the power to make treaties gave him enough authority. The purchase opened a vast, unknown frontier. What was out there? What people? What animals? What rivers, mountains, and dangers? To find out, Jefferson organized one of the most famous expeditions in American history. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, along with a small team of soldiers, scouts, and interpreters, set off from St. Louis, heading west. Their mission: explore the new territory, map a route to the Pacific Ocean, and establish trade with Native American tribes. They traveled for over 2 years, crossing rivers, plains, and snow-covered mountains. They met dozens of native nations. One woman, Sacagawea, a Shoshone interpreter, played a crucial role, guiding them through dangerous terrain and building trust with indigenous peoples. By the time they returned in 1806, Lewis and Clark had charted a path to the Pacific, collected detailed information on the landscape, and opened the door to Western expansion. Back in Washington, Jefferson worked to reduce government power. He cut taxes, shrank the military, and tried to lower the national debt. But the outside world wouldn't stay quiet. American ships faced harassment from Barbary pirates in North Africa, and rising tensions with Britain and France threatened American neutrality. Jefferson tried to avoid war by banning trade with both nations through the Embargo Act of 1807, but the move backfired. American merchants suffered. The economy slowed, and Jefferson's popularity began to slip. Even so, his presidency left a massive legacy. The Louisiana Purchase transformed the nation's geography. The Lewis and Clark expedition awakened the American imagination, and Jefferson's ideas about liberty, government, and democracy continued to shape the national identity. He stepped down in 1809, keeping with the tradition of peaceful transition, but conflict loomed again. Part 14. Rising Tensions and the War of 1812. By the early 1800s, the young United States was still defining itself. A republic surrounded by empires, fragile in strength, but bold in ambition. And on the seas, American independence was being tested once again. The primary threat, Great Britain. Though the Revolution had ended decades earlier, Britain had not truly let go. They still held forts in the Northwest Territory, encouraged native resistance to American expansion, and most aggressively targeted American shipping. At sea, Britain was locked in a massive war with Napoleon's France. In their eyes, neutral nations like the U.S. were fair game. British warships regularly stopped American vessels, seized cargo, and worst of all, impressed sailors. Impressment meant capturing American sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. Thousands were taken. Outrage grew. Then came the breaking point. In 1807, the British ship Leopard attacked the American ship Chesapeake, just off the coast of Virginia. American blood was spilled in American waters. President Thomas Jefferson tried diplomacy, imposing the Embargo Act, which halted trade with all foreign nations. But the move crippled the American economy and failed to change British behavior. When James Madison became president in 1809, the pressure only increased. A growing group in Congress known as the War Hawks called for action. Led by figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, they believed the United States had to defend its honor, protect its trade, and possibly expand into Canada, then controlled by Britain. On June 18, 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain. The War of 1812 had begun, but America wasn't truly ready. Military was small. The economy was still recovering. And not all Americans supported the war, especially in New England, where trade with Britain was vital. Early campaigns to invade Canada failed. Cities were burned. Troops were captured. Morale dropped. But slowly, momentum shifted. American forces won key victories, including naval battles on the Great Lakes and a surprising triumph at Lake Erie, led by Oliver Hazard Perry, who declared, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Meanwhile, Native American nations were drawn into the war. Many, led by the Shawnee warrior Tecumseh, sided with the British. Hoping to stop U.S. expansion, Tecumseh fought bravely but was killed in 1813. And native resistance in the Northwest began to collapse. Then came the darkest moment. In 1814, after defeating Napoleon, Britain turned its full attention to America. They invaded the Chesapeake Bay, marched into Washington, D.C., and burned the Capitol and the White House. It was a national humiliation. But the American spirit didn't break. Later that year, British forces attacked Fort McHenry in Baltimore. All night, American defenders held firm. A young lawyer named Francis Scott Key, watching the battle from a ship, saw the flag still flying at dawn. He wrote a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, that would one day become the national anthem. In the South, the final and most famous battle took place at New Orleans in January 1815. A ragtag American force, led by General Andrew Jackson, crushed the British in a stunning victory. Ironically, the battle was fought after a peace treaty had already been signed. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war. There were no clear territorial changes, but both sides agreed to stop fighting. In the end, the War of 1812 settled little on paper, but symbolically, it was huge. The United States had stood up to Britain, Genin survived, national pride surged. The war produced heroes, myths, and songs, and it marked the true arrival of the U.S. as a sovereign power on the global stage. Part 15. The Era of Good Feelings and American Expansion. The War of 1812 had ended, and America had survived. In its wake came a moment of unusual peace, pride, and unity. This time would be remembered, somewhat optimistically, as the era of good feelings. The year was 1817. James Monroe had just become the 5th President of the United States. He traveled across the country to build goodwill and was met with parades, cannon fire, and celebration. For a brief moment, the political temperature cooled. The old Federalist Party had faded after opposing the War of 1812. Only the Democratic Republicans remained strong, giving an impression, though not the full reality, of national harmony. But beneath this surface of unity, deep currents of change and conflict were moving. One of the most dramatic changes: westward expansion. Following the Louisiana Purchase and the war, Americans flooded westward into Ohio, Indiana, Alabama, and beyond. New states joined the Union. Settlers carved farms from forests and grasslands, and Native American tribes were pushed further and further from their ancestral lands. This period saw a new burst of infrastructure. Roads, canals, and later railroads began to knit the vast American interior together. In 1819, the Erie Canal was begun, a massive engineering feat that would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, turning New York into the economic capital of the nation. But economic growth brought new problems. The Panic of 1819, the nation's first major financial crisis, revealed the fragile nature of the young economy. Banks failed, land values crashed, unemployment spread, and many began to question whether the government should control economic policy. Yet the most divisive issue remained slavery. As new Western territories applied for statehood, a question emerged: would they allow slavery or not? In 1820, tensions reached a boiling point over the admission of Missouri as a slave state. The solution was the Missouri Compromise. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, Maine to enter as a free state, preserving the balance in Congress. It also drew a line across the Louisiana Territory, 3630 north above, which slavery was banned in the future. The compromise postponed conflict, but it did not solve it. It drew a literal and symbolic line through the country, foreshadowing the deeper divide to come. Meanwhile, in foreign affairs, Monroe made a bold declaration. In 1823, he issued the Monroe Doctrine. It warned European powers. The Western Hemisphere was now off-limits to new colonization. In return, the U.S. would stay out of European conflicts. It was a bold statement for a relatively young nation, but it reflected growing confidence and ambition. America was no longer just surviving. It was expanding, building, defining itself. But with every step westward and every new mile of road and canal, new questions followed. Who belonged in this country? What rights did they have? How long could peace hold while deep divisions remained unresolved? Part 16. The Rise of Andrew Jackson and the Age of the Common Man. In 1828, a new era of American politics began with the election of Andrew Jackson, a war hero and populist champion. Jackson's victory marked a dramatic shift. Power moved away from the old elites and toward the common man. Jackson was born in a frontier cabin, fought in the Revolutionary War as a boy, and later earned fame defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He presented himself as a defender of everyday Americans against corrupt insiders. His supporters formed the Democratic Party, dedicated to expanding political participation. Under Jackson, voting rights broadened, white male suffrage replaced property requirements in most states, bringing millions more into the political process. But democracy's expansion came with darker consequences. Jackson's spoils system rewarded loyal supporters with government jobs, entrenching partisanship and graft. He vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, arguing it favored the wealthy elite and violated states' rights. His decisive strike against the bank reshaped the national economy, leading to new banks, speculation, and financial instability. And then there was the tragic chapter of Indian removal. Jackson viewed Native American nations as obstacles to white settlement. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of tens of thousands of indigenous people from the southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. The brutal enforcement of this policy led to the Trail of Tears, the forced march of the Cherokee and Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole peoples. Thousands died of disease, exposure, and starvation along the way. Jackson celebrated such actions as progress, but for indigenous nations, it was catastrophe. Jackson's presidency also faced serious challenges. The nullification crisis of 1832, when South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariffs, testing the balance between state and federal power. Jackson responded forcefully, declaring nullification illegal and readying troops to uphold federal law. The Bank War, which destabilized finance and contributed to the Panic of 1837 just after he left office. Yet Jackson remained wildly popular. He positioned himself as America's defender of democracy for white men, of the Union against separatists, and of ordinary citizens against distant elites. When he stepped down in 1837, Jackson had fundamentally changed American politics. The presidency became a more powerful and visible office. Partisan politics grew more organized and intense. The concept of the common man took root, though, only for a segment of the population. Jackson's legacy is complex. He expanded democracy for many, yet devastated entire peoples. He championed popular rule, yet wielded power with little restraint. Part 17. The Panic of 1837. Reform Movements and Westward Migration. When Andrew Jackson left office in 1837, he handed the presidency to his loyal vice president, Art Van Buren. But Van Buren's presidency would be haunted by the consequences of Jackson's economic policies. Just months into his term, disaster struck. The nation was plunged into a major financial crisis, the Panic of 1837. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, prices for crops, especially cotton, plummeted. Thousands lost their jobs and many families lost everything. At the heart of the panic was speculation, easy credit, land bubbles, and the sudden withdrawal of federal funds from the national bank had created a fragile economy. Jackson's decision to remove federal deposits had shattered financial stability. Now, the public paid the price. The crisis lasted for years, and Van Buren, despite efforts to create an independent treasury, was widely blamed. He lost re-election in 1842, a war hero, with a catchy slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. The winner, William Henry Harrison, gave the longest inaugural address in history and died just 1 month later. His Vice President John Tyler assumed the presidency. But even as the nation staggered economically, social and political movements were rising, aiming to remake American society. Across the North and parts of the West, the Second Great Awakening swept through communities. It was a wave of religious revival, stressing personal salvation, emotional sermons, and moral reform. This spiritual energy inspired a range of reform movements. Abolitionism, the call to end slavery in all its forms. Led by fiery voices like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth. Women's rights, a growing movement inspired by activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who in 1848 organized the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights gathering in U.S. history. Temperance, aimed at reducing alcohol consumption and promoting social order. Prison and mental health reform, led by reformers like Dorothea Dix, who fought for better treatment of the mentally ill. At the same time, millions of Americans were moving west. Driven by the promise of cheap land, gold, and a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the U.S. was destined to expand from coast to coast, settlers poured into new territories. They traveled by wagon, horseback, or foot, following trails like the Oregon Trail or heading to newly annexed lands. But westward expansion came at a cost. Native Americans were driven from their lands, often through violence and broken treaties. Mexico clashed with the U.S. over territorial ambitions, and as new territories emerged, the same burning question returned. Would slavery be allowed in the West? This question would only grow louder. Part 18. Texas, the Mexican-American War, and a nation divided. As Americans pushed westward, one region would become the flashpoint for expansion, conflict, and division. That place was Texas. In the early 1800s, Texas was part of Mexico. To encourage settlement, the Mexican government invited American settlers known as Texians to move into the region. They brought families, farms, and eventually slavery. But Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, and as more American settlers arrived, tensions with the Mexican government deepened. In 1836, those tensions exploded into open rebellion. American settlers and Tejanos declared independence from Mexico, forming the Republic of Texas. Fighting broke out. The most legendary battle was the Siege of the Alamo. At a small mission in San Antonio, a few hundred Texian defenders, including Davy Crockett and James Bowie, held out for 13 days. Against thousands of Mexican troops led by General Santa Anna, they were overwhelmed, and nearly all were killed. But their stand became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo? A few weeks later, Texian forces under Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, securing independence. Texas became its own Republic of country with Houston as its president. But it wasn't long before Texas asked to join the United States. That request was controversial. Texas allowed slavery, and admitting it as a state would upset the fragile balance between slave and free states in Congress. It took nearly a decade, but in 1845, Texas was officially annexed by the U.S. Mexico was furious. Diplomatic relations collapsed. President James K. Polk, a strong believer in manifest destiny, sent troops to the disputed Texas-Mexico border. In 1846, shots were fired. Congress declared war. The Mexican-American War had begun. It was a swift and brutal campaign. American forces under Zachary Taylor pushed into northern Mexico. General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz and marched all the way to Mexico City. Future Civil War generals Grant Lee Sherman all fought in this war. In 1848, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The results were staggering. Mexico lost nearly half its territory. United States gained what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This was the largest land acquisition in American history since the Louisiana Purchase. But it came with consequences. The new lands reopened, a national wound. Would slavery be allowed in these new territories? Some argued for freedom, others for slavery. Some, like Senator Stephen Douglas, proposed letting settlers decide through popular sovereignty. In 1850, to hold the Union together, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. It included California entering as a free state. The Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens to help capture escaped slaves, allowing Utah and New Mexico to decide on slavery later. The compromise postponed conflict, but deepened divisions. And all the while, voices for abolition were growing louder, resistance to slavery more widespread. The road ahead was clear. The country was heading toward a crisis it could no longer ignore. Part 19. Abolition, the Underground Railroad, and the Road to Civil War. By the 1850s, the United States was growing, in land, in population, in industry, but the issue of slavery was tearing the country apart. The North was changing. Cities expanded. Factories multiplied. A new wave of immigrants arrived from Ireland, Germany, and beyond. And though racism remained deeply rooted, many Northerners began calling for an end to slavery. The South, by contrast, remained rural and agricultural, its economy tied to cotton and built on the backs of millions of enslaved African Americans. The abolitionist movement, those who demanded an end to slavery, grew louder. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved, became one of the nation's most powerful voices for freedom. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that awakened the conscience of many Northerners to the horrors of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, published fiery calls for immediate emancipation. But abolition wasn't just speeches and books, it was also action. The Underground Railroad, a secret network of routes and safe houses, helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave herself, returned south over a dozen times, guiding hundreds to freedom at enormous personal risk. To those she helped, she was called Moses. Yet for every act of resistance, the South responded with greater force. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave slave catchers the right to pursue escaped slaves into free states and required citizens to assist them. This law outraged Northerners. Many refused to comply. Tensions escalated. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery popular sovereignty. This overturned the Missouri Compromise and opened the door to conflict. In Kansas, the result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory, each hoping to sway the vote. Violence erupted. Towns were burned. People were killed. became known as Bleeding Kansas. Then, in 1857, came one of the most controversial decisions in Supreme Court history. Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had lived with his master in free territory. He sued for his freedom, but the court ruled that African Americans, free or enslaved, were not citizens. Congress had no right to ban slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. This ruling effectively opened all Western territories to slavery and devastated abolitionists. Meanwhile, a rising political force emerged, the Republican Party, founded on opposition to the spread of slavery. Among its most powerful voices was a tall, thoughtful lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. In 1858, Lincoln debated Senator Stephen Douglas in a series of speeches watched by the entire nation. Lincoln believed slavery was morally wrong. Douglas believed each state should decide for itself. The stage was being set for a national reckoning. Then, in 1859, abolitionist John Brown launched a violent raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's, Ferry, hoping to ignite a slave uprising. His plan failed. He was captured and hanged. To the south, he was a terrorist. To the north, a martyr. By 1860, the nation was coming apart. And when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, without carrying a single southern state, the South saw it as a threat to their way of life. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded from the Union. One by one, other southern states followed. The divide was no longer political. It was geographic, moral, economic, constitutional, human. The United States was no longer united. Part 20. Secession, Lincoln, and the start of the Civil War. The year was 1860. The nation stood on the edge of a cliff. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, a lawyer, and a former congressman from Illinois, had just been elected president. He had won without carrying a single southern state. To many in the South, this wasn't just a political loss. It was the end of their way of life. They feared Lincoln would abolish slavery. And while Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, he was firmly against its expansion into new territories. That alone was enough. On December 20th, 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's victory, South Carolina seceded from the Union. One by one, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Together, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. The message was clear. The South believed the Union was voluntary, and if it no longer protected their interests, they had the right to leave. The North, especially Lincoln, saw things differently. He believed the Union was perpetual, and no state could leave it without consent. But Lincoln would not take office until March 4th, 1861, and in those weeks the Union teetered. Outgoing President James Buchanan did little to stop the secession. And as tensions grew, federal forts in the South became flashpoints. The most important of them all was Fort Sumter, a small military post in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Lincoln, upon taking office, faced an impossible choice: reinforce the fort and risk war, or abandon it and signal weakness. He chose a third path: send supplies, but no weapons. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire. The fort's defenders held for 34 hours, but were eventually forced to surrender. No one died in the bombardment, but the shot had been fired. The Civil War had begun. The days that followed, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. 11 states formed the Confederacy, and the United States of America was split in 2. The North had more than twice the population, nearly all of the industry, most of the railroads and naval power, but the South had a deep military tradition, a culture willing to fight fiercely for its beliefs, and generals like Robert E. Lee who would become legendary. Each side believed it was fighting for freedom, the North for a nation united and the end of slavery, the South for self-determination and a way of life built on slavery. What followed would be the bloodiest conflict in American history. Families were torn apart, cities were burned. Over 600,000 lives would be lost. But the Civil War was more than just a battle between states. It was a battle over the soul of the nation. Part 21. The Civil War begins. Battles, strategies, and bloodshed. The war had begun. Two nations now stood in conflict, one seeking to preserve the Union, the other to build a new Confederacy, free from federal control. But no one expected what came next, a 4-year bloodbath that would leave cities in ruins, families shattered, and the nation forever changed. The first major clash came in July 1861 at a place called Bull Run in Virginia. Civilians came from Washington to watch, expecting a quick Union victory. Instead, they watched in horror as the Confederate Army, under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, held firm and counterattacked. The Union Army fled in chaos. It was a shocking realization. This war would not be over in a few weeks. It would be long, brutal, and costly.
Outside scrambled to organize. Gotta!
The Union, under General George McClellan, built up massive forces and focused on capturing the Confederate capital, Richmond. But McClellan was too cautious. He delayed attacks, feared enemy strength, and allowed the Confederates to escape time and again. In the West, however, the Union found success. A rising general named Ulysses S. Grant captured key forts in Tennessee. Opening the Mississippi River, Grant's toughness and aggression won him respect and command. Then came the bloodiest single day in American history, the Battle of Antietam. In September 1862, Lee had taken his army into Maryland, hoping for a Confederate victory on northern soil. But McClellan intercepted him. The result was a titanic clash. Over 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in just one day. Tactically, it was a draw. But strategically, it was a turning point, because it gave Abraham Lincoln the moment he needed. Days later, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. It didn't free slaves in the border states loyal to the Union, but it transformed the war into a battle not just for the Union, but for freedom itself. The proclamation also discouraged foreign nations like Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. Now, supporting the South meant supporting slavery. The war intensified. In the East, battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville saw Confederate victories, but at a high cost. At Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men. He died days later. The South had lost one of its finest commanders. Then came Gettysburg. In July 1863, Lee invaded the North again, this time into Pennsylvania. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces clashed in the fields and hills around the small town of Gettysburg. On the final day, Lee ordered a massive assault pickets charge across open ground. It was a disaster. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were cut down. The army retreated, never to invade the North again. At the same time, Grant had surrounded the city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. After a long siege, the city surrendered, giving the Union control of the entire river and splitting the Confederacy in two. These two victories, Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west, marked the turning point of the war. But the conflict was far from over. Part 22. Grant, Sherman, and the collapse of the Confederacy. By 1864, the Civil War had raged for 3 bloody years. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The nation was scarred, its people weary. But the end was in sight. President Abraham Lincoln, determined to finish the fight, turned to one man, a quiet, relentless general from the West, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had proven himself at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, winning key battles with aggressive strategy and unshakable resolve. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted him to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant's plan was simple but brutal. In the East, he would pursue Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia without pause. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman would strike deep into the South. Grant began a grinding campaign in Virginia. From May to June, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a series of horrific battles. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Each battle brought staggering losses, tens of thousands dead and wounded. Unlike his predecessors, Grant did not retreat. He kept pushing. By June 1864, Grant had pinned Lee down outside Petersburg, a vital rail hub south of Richmond. The two armies dug in for a siege that would last nearly 10 months. Meanwhile, to the south, Sherman marched. His goal, capture Atlanta, destroy Confederate infrastructure, and break the South's will to fight. Atlanta fell in September 1864, a major Union victory. It boosted Northern morale and helped Lincoln win re-election in November. Then came the most devastating campaign of the war, Sherman's infamous March to the Sea. With 60,000 troops, he marched from Atlanta to Savannah,
Ow.
cutting a 300-mile path through Georgia. He burned crops, destroyed railroads, and seized supplies not to kill civilians, but to cripple the Confederacy's ability to wage war. It was a new kind of warfare designed to break not just armies, but the society behind them. Sherman captured Savannah in December, then turned north through the Carolinas. Back in Virginia, the siege of Petersburg wore on, supplies dwindled, Confederate soldiers began deserting. By April 1865, Lee could no longer hold the line. He evacuated Richmond, and the Confederate capital fell. Grant pursued Lee west. The final confrontation came at a quiet Virginia village, Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in the home of Wilmer McLean. They're surrounded by officers on both sides. Lee surrendered. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers could keep their swords, even their horses for spring planting. There was no parade, no humiliation, only silence. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery was dying. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 620,000 dead, millions more wounded, displaced, or mourning. Cities in ashes. A nation still divided, spiritually, and politically. Just 5 days later, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, while attending a play at Ford's Theater, President Abraham Lincoln was shot by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died the next morning. The man who had saved the Union, who had guided the country through its greatest trial, was gone. The Civil War had ended. But the next battle, how to rebuild, how to reunite, and how to define freedom, was just beginning. Part 23. Reconstruction and the Struggle for Equality. The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but America's wounds were still wide open. The North had won the war, but how would it win the peace? Could the Union be restored? Could 4 million newly freed African Americans find justice, safety, and opportunity? Could a broken South be rebuilt? This was the era of Reconstruction, a period of enormous promise and deep betrayal. It began in 1865 with the death of President Abraham Lincoln. His assassination stunned the nation and left the task of reunifying the country to Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction was lenient toward the South. He allowed former Confederate leaders to return to power, pardoned many of them, and offered few protections to formerly enslaved people. Southern states quickly passed laws known as Black Codes, designed to restrict the rights of African Americans, banning them from voting, controlling where they could live and work, forcing them into labor contracts little better than slavery. In response, Congress pushed back. Led by the radical Republicans, Congress passed new laws to protect civil rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was created to help former slaves with food, education, and legal support. The 14th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law to all born in the U.S. The 15th Amendment followed, declaring that voting rights could not be denied based on race or color. For a brief time, America witnessed something extraordinary. Black men voted, ran for office, and won. More than 2,000 African Americans held public office during Reconstruction. Public schools were built across the South. Freed communities built churches, businesses, and entire towns. But not everyone welcomed this progress. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in violent resistance, burning homes, lynching black citizens, and attacking politicians who supported racial equality. Meanwhile, President Johnson clashed constantly with Congress. He became the first president to be impeached. Though he narrowly avoided removal, in 1868, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant became president. He supported Reconstruction efforts and used federal troops to protect black voters in the South. But corruption scandals and fading Northern interest weakened his presidency. By the mid-1870s, the political will to continue Reconstruction was crumbling. Then came the election of 1876, one of the most disputed in U.S. history. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes lost the popular vote, but struck a deal with Southern Democrats to win the presidency. In exchange, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. This compromise ended Reconstruction and opened the door to a new era of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Southern states quickly passed Jim Crow laws, segregating schools, transportation, and public spaces. Black Americans were denied the vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. The dream of a multiracial democracy was crushed and wouldn't begin to rise again for nearly a century. Still, Reconstruction had planted seeds. The 14th and 15th Amendments would become the foundation for the civil rights movement 100 years later. The courage of newly freed people who built families, communities, and institutions in the face of oppression remains one of the most powerful chapters in American history. The Civil War had answered the question, could the Union survive? Reconstruction asked a deeper one. What kind of Union would it be? Part 24. The Gilded Age. Industry, injustice, and innovation. After the end of Reconstruction in 1877, America entered a new chapter. A time of explosive growth, bold innovation, and deep corruption. A time of gleaming fortunes and grinding poverty. A time known as the Gilded Age. The term was coined by Mark Twain, who saw the era as glittering on the surface, but rotting underneath. He was right. Between 1877 and 1900, the United States transformed. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories filled the cities. Immigrants poured in by the millions. Fortunes were made overnight, but so too were lives broken. Industrial titans and robber barons. At the heart of this transformation were a handful of powerful men. They were praised as captains of industry and condemned as robber barons. Andrew Carnegie, who built a steel empire by cutting costs and breaking unions. John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil, dominating over 90% of the U.S. oil industry. J.P. Morgan, a banker who financed railroads, bought out failing companies, and essentially ran the American economy. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made millions in shipping and railroads. These men pioneered vertical and horizontal integration, monopolizing their industries and crushing competition. The result? Unimaginable wealth and unprecedented inequality. While the elite dined in marble mansions, factory workers labored 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions for pennies. Labor fights back, but the working class began to organize. The Knights of Labor. Then the American Federation of Labor emerged to demand better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes erupted. The Haymarket Riot in 1886, where a bomb exploded during a labor rally in Chicago, sparking nationwide fear. The Homestead Strike in 1892, where Carnegie's steelworkers battled private security forces. The Pullman Strike in 1894, which shut down rail traffic across the country until federal troops intervened. The government, more often than not, sided with business. Still, labor's voice was growing. A new wave of immigration. At the same time, millions of immigrants were arriving in America. They came from Italy, Russia, Ireland, China, Poland, and many other places, fleeing famine, persecution, and poverty. They landed at Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in San Francisco, bringing hopes, dreams, and cultural richness. But they also faced nativism discrimination from Americans who saw them as threats to jobs and social order. Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 targeted specific groups, marking the beginning of federal immigration control. Invention and innovation. Despite the inequality, the Gilded Age was also an age of remarkable innovation. Thomas Edison gave us the electric light bulb, the phonograph, and more. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Nikola Tesla revolutionized electricity with alternating current. Henry Ford, though his rise came later, pioneered the assembly line model of production. Cities transformed, electricity lit up streets. Steel-framed skyscrapers reached into the sky. Elevators rose, telegraphs ticked, trains rumbled, corruption in politics. But in government, corruption was rampant. Big business bought politicians. Local machines like Tammany Hall in New York traded favors for votes. Bribes, kickbacks, and backroom deals were the norm, and yet reform movements began to stir. Muckraking journalists exposed scandals. Social reformers called for change. It was clear that as America surged forward, it would soon have to confront the darker truths of its progress. Part 25. The Progressive Era. Reform rights and the rise of Roosevelt. As the 20th century dawned, America stood at a crossroads. The Gilded Age had built railroads, steel empires, and staggering fortunes, but it had also left behind poverty, child labor, unsafe working conditions, and political corruption. The response was the Progressive Era, a nationwide push to reform the system and make America live up to its ideals. Between the 1890s and 1920s, a coalition of reformers, journalists, activists, and politicians sought to fix what industrialization had broken. The muckrakers. Journalism with a mission. One of the most powerful tools of the era was investigative journalism, known as muckrakers. These writers exposed the dark corners of American life. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, uncovering the filthy conditions of Chicago's meatpacking plants. His book shocked the public and led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Ida Tarbell published a blistering exposé of Standard Oil, laying bare Rockefeller's ruthless tactics. Lincoln Steffens revealed corruption in city governments and the shame of the cities. They didn't just inform the public, they inspired action, fighting for the people. Progressives believed that government should work for the people, not for corporations. They pushed for reforms like child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, 8-hour workdays, minimum wage protections, antitrust laws to break up monopolies. In 1901, the progressive cause gained a powerful ally. Theodore Roosevelt became president after the assassination of William McKinley. Theodore Roosevelt, the trustbuster. Roosevelt brought energy, charisma, and a fierce belief in fairness to the presidency. He believed in the square deal, fairness for business, labor, and the consumer. He took on the big corporations, earning the nickname Trustbuster. He broke up the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads. Roosevelt also championed conservation. He set aside millions of acres of forest and parkland, created the national park system, and established wildlife refuges and national monuments. To Roosevelt, the presidency was a bully pulpit, a platform to speak directly to the people and drive change. Voices for justice. Progressive reform went beyond labor and business. Women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells fought for the right to vote. African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois co-founded the NAACP, demanding civil rights and an end to lynching. Immigrant communities pushed for education, fair housing, and political representation. In 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, allowing Americans to directly elect their U.S. senators. And in 1919, after decades of protest, the 18th Amendment banned alcohol ushering and prohibition. A year later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. New challenges ahead, but even as reforms succeeded, new tensions emerged. Many progressive reforms excluded people of color and immigrants. The country was becoming more involved in global affairs, soon to face the fires of World War I. And prohibition, meant to solve social problems, would instead fuel crime, corruption, and division. Still, the Progressive Era marked a major shift. Government was no longer just the servant of industry, it was becoming the instrument of reform. Part 26, World War I, and the birth of the American century. By the early 20th century, America was no longer just a rising nation. It was a growing global power. But the spark that pulled the United States onto the world stage came from across the Atlantic. In 1914, the world was plunged into chaos after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. This event triggered a chain reaction between alliances in Europe, and soon much of the world was at war. The conflict was called the Great War. What we now know as World War I, the U.S. stays neutral at first. At first, the United States stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson urged Americans to remain impartial in thought, as well as in action. But neutrality didn't mean inaction. The U.S. continued to trade with Europe, especially with Britain and France, while tensions with Germany grew. German U-boat submarines began sinking ships in the Atlantic. Then came a turning point. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania, a British passenger ship. Killing 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, public opinion began to shift. The road to war. In 1917, two events pushed the U.S. into the war. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting any ship heading to Allied ports. The Zimmermann telegram was intercepted. Germany had proposed an alliance with Mexico, offering to help it regain Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. If war broke out with the U.S., these provocations were too much. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America mobilizes. The U.S. quickly launched a massive mobilization. Millions of men were drafted into the military. Women took on roles in factories, farms, and nursing units. African Americans enlisted in large numbers, though they served in segregated units and often faced discrimination. On the home front, the government launched propaganda campaigns to support the war effort. Liberty bonds were sold. Food was rationed. Citizens were urged to do your part. The war ends. By 1918, over 2 million American soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, had arrived in Europe. Their fresh troops helped turn the tide against Germany. After 4 years of trench warfare, poison gas, and millions of deaths, the Central Powers collapsed. Germany signed an armistice on November 11, 1918. The war was over. But the peace was uneasy. The Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's vision. At the Paris Peace Conference, President Wilson proposed his 14 points of vision for a fair and lasting peace. At the heart of his plan was the creation of a League of Nations and international organization to prevent future wars. But the final treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, was harsh. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. It had to pay huge reparations, lose territory, and limit its military. Wilson brought the treaty home, but Congress rejected it. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations. America would return to isolationism for a time. The Roaring Twenties began. As soldiers returned home, the 1920s began. The U.S. emerged from World War I stronger than ever, with booming industries, a rising middle class, and global influence. But underneath the celebration, tensions remained. Racial violence erupted in cities like Chicago and Tulsa. Women had won the right to vote, but still faced economic inequality. A new era of consumerism, credit, and stock market speculation was rising fast. The war had ended. But the century of American dominance, the so-called American century, had just begun. Part 27. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. The war was over. The world had changed. And in America, the 1920s roared to life. The decade was fast, flashy, and full of contradictions. It was a time of freedom and repression, of jazz and lynchings, of booming stock markets and growing instability. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and for good reason. A new America emerges, the U.S. Economy surged. Factories that once built weapons now produce cars, radios, and appliances. Henry Ford's assembly line made automobiles affordable for the middle class, bringing mobility to millions. Advertising boomed. Consumer credit soared. People bought not just what they needed, but what they wanted. Cities like New York and Chicago flourished. Skyscrapers rose. Speakeasies buzzed. And jazz music. Born in black communities became the heartbeat of a generation. This was the Jazz Age. The culture wore beneath the surface. But not everyone embraced the modern era. In Tennessee, the Scopes trial became a national sensation in 1925 when a teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution. It wasn't just about science. It was a clash between tradition and progress. Prohibition. Enacted by the 18th Amendment, made alcohol illegal. Instead of ending drinking, it created a black market of bootleggers, gangsters, and corrupt police. Figures like Al Capone ruled the streets of Chicago, and organized crime flourished. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a terrifying revival, spreading racism and hate far beyond the South. While the 1920s sparkled for some immigrants, African Americans and rural Americans often found themselves left out or pushed down. Harlem Renaissance, and social change. Amidst all this, a cultural revolution was unfolding. The Harlem Renaissance. In this thriving New York neighborhood, black artists, writers, poets, and musicians redefined American culture. Langston Hughes gave voice to black dreams and struggles. Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong captivated audiences across racial lines. For the first time, Black America was shaping the national conversation not from the margins, but from the center. And in 1920, American women won the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was a triumph decades in the making. Women now entered public life in greater numbers, working, voting, and redefining gender roles.
The crash.
But beneath the glamour, danger was building. Banks made risky loans. Investors bought stocks on credit. Regulation was weak. The economy seemed unstoppable, and it wasn't. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. It began with panic selling and cascaded into a historic collapse, wiping out fortunes overnight. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared. It was the start of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. By 1933, 25% of Americans were unemployed. Thousands of banks had collapsed. Families lost homes, farms, and futures. People lined up at soup kitchens. Dust storms ravaged the plains. Confidence in capitalism was shaken. The American dream had turned into a nightmare. A nation in despair. In the face of collapse, Americans turned to government for help. In 1932, they elected a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He promised a New Deal. But could government save a broken economy and restore faith in the American system? Part 28. The New Deal and the Fight to Rebuild America. By 1933, the United States was on its knees. Banks had collapsed. Factories had shut down. Families lost everything, and a generation of Americans wondered if the American dream was over. Into this storm stepped a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or simply FDR. With his confident voice and steady presence, he promised something the country desperately needed: hope. The first 100 days. In his first inaugural address, Roosevelt famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And then he got to work. In his first 100 days in office, FDR and Congress launched a flurry of legislation to stabilize the economy and put people back to work. This sweeping plan was called the New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. The New Deal focused on three goals: relief for the unemployed, recovery of the economy, reform to prevent future collapses. New agencies appeared almost overnight. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men to plant trees, build parks, and protect the environment. The Public Works Administration and Works Progress Administration built roads, schools, bridges, and airports, creating millions of jobs. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and development to some of the poorest regions in the country. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled. These programs didn't end the Depression overnight, but they put food on tables and hope in hearts, changing the role of government. Before the New Deal, government played a limited role in everyday life. Now, Americans look to Washington for jobs, security, and protection from economic disaster. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created to protect people's bank deposits. The Securities and Exchange Commission was formed to regulate Wall Street and prevent another crash. FDR's government expanded like never before, and so did the national debate. Praise and criticism. Many Americans loved Roosevelt. He gave regular fireside chats on the radio, speaking directly to the people with warmth and clarity. But others called him a socialist, a dictator, even a threat to freedom. The Supreme Court struck down several of his programs, calling them unconstitutional. In response, Roosevelt proposed a controversial plan to add new justices to the court, what critics called a court-packing scheme. Though the plan failed, the court eventually upheld most New Deal reforms. FDR won re-election in 1936 by a landslide, but the Depression was far from over. Voices from the margins. While the New Deal helped many, it didn't help everyone equally. Black Americans were often last hired and first fired. They faced segregation, discrimination, and violence, especially in the Jim Crow South. Still, many supported FDR, seeing him as better than previous leaders. Mexican Americans faced mass deportations, even those born in the U.S. women. While active in the New Deal like Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member still faced major barriers to equality. And yet, in this time of hardship, Americans also found resilience. Families huddled around radios. Artists and writers captured the spirit of the age. Ordinary people organized, voted, and demanded a better future. The world on the brink. As the U.S. struggled to rebuild, dark clouds gathered overseas. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had risen to power. In Italy, Mussolini embraced fascism. In Japan, military leaders dreamed of empire. By the late 1930s, the world was sliding toward another catastrophic war. Would America stay out or be pulled in again? Part 29. World War II. Arsenal of Democracy and the Fight for Freedom. The 1930s ended with the world in turmoil. Fascism was rising, democracies were crumbling, and the specter of war loomed once again. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had turned Germany into a dictatorship, blaming Jews and outsiders for the country's hardships. In Italy, Benito Mussolini promised to rebuild a Roman Empire. And in Asia, Imperial Japan invaded China, hungry for land and power. By 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. America watches, then arms. At first, the United States stayed neutral, still scarred by the horrors of World War I. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that the fight for democracy abroad would soon involve America. In 1940, he declared the U.S. would become the arsenal of democracy, sending supplies, weapons, and aid to Britain, France, and later the Soviet Union. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor, a day of infamy. Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They bombed U.S. battleships, airfields, and harbors in a surprise attack. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress and declared, "A date which will live in infamy." The United States was now at war, a global conflict. World War II became the largest and deadliest war in human history. The Axis powers Germany, Italy, and Japan sought global domination. The Allies led by the U.S., Britain, the Soviet Union, and China fought to stop them. The war stretched across Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and Asia. America mobilized on a scale never seen before. The home front. At home, the U.S. became a war machine. Factories converted from cars to tanks, from toasters to rifles. Women joined the workforce in massive numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Americans rationed food, collected scrap, and bought war bonds. The economy surged. Unemployment vanished. Patriotism soared. But there were also injustices. After Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans, most U.S. citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps, stripped of property and freedom. It remains one of the darkest chapters in U.S. civil rights history, the battles of Europe and the Pacific. In Europe, American and British forces landed in North Africa, then Italy. On June 6, 1944 today, Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, opening a Western front against Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union fought bitterly from the east, pushing through Poland and into Germany. In April 1945, Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered soon after. Victory in Europe Day was declared on May 8, 1945, but the war was not over. In the Pacific, Japan fought fiercely, defending islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa at incredible cost. American forces moved island to island, closing in on Japan, the atomic bomb. Then came a terrifying new weapon, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Over 200,000 people were killed, many instantly, others over time from radiation. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over. The cost of victory. World War II had claimed the lives of over 60 million people worldwide, more than 400,000 Americans. But the war also ended the Great Depression, transformed American industry, and positioned the U.S. as one of the world's two superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union. And when the world saw the horrors of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered by the Nazi regime, the war's moral stakes became clearer than ever before. The U.S. emerged as a global leader, economically, militarily, and ideologically. But peace would not last long. A new kind of war was coming, fought not on battlefields, but in politics, espionage, and nuclear threats. Part 30. The Cold War. America versus the Soviet Union. World War II had ended, but peace didn't mean unity. As two superpowers emerged from the ashes, the United States championing democracy and capitalism, the Soviet Union promoting communism and state control. They had fought side by side against Hitler. But by 1947, they were locked in a new kind of conflict. It wasn't a war of armies, but of ideologies, intelligence, influence, and fear. This was the Cold War, a global standoff that would define the next 4 decades. 2 worlds, 1 planet. The US and USSR raced to shape the post-war world. The Marshall Plan pumped billions into rebuilding Western Europe, aimed at resisting communist influence. In response, the Soviets tightened control over Eastern Europe, stalling communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and more. By 1949, Europe was split. West, free, capitalist, and American-aligned. East, controlled, communist, and Soviet-aligned. Metaphorical line divided the continent. The Iron Curtain, the arms race, and nuclear standoff. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb. The U.S. was no longer the sole nuclear power. An arms race began, as both countries built thousands of nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the planet many times over. This fear of mutually assured destruction kept both sides from launching a direct attack, but it also kept the world on edge. Children practiced nuclear drills at school. Families built bomb shelters. One mistake, one miscalculation, could mean the end. Conflicts in the shadows. Though the US and USSR never fought directly, they clashed through others. In Korea, the North, backed by China and the Soviets, invaded the South. The US led a UN coalition to defend South Korea. After years of brutal combat, the war ended in a stalemate, with Korea still divided at the 38th parallel. In Vietnam, the U.S. would later fight a long, devastating war, trying to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The CIA and Soviet agents backed coups, revolutions, and governments turning small countries into Cold War battlegrounds. Spies, satellites, and space. The Cold War also played out in the shadows. Espionage became a deadly game. The CIA and the KGB engaged in covert missions, assassinations, and intelligence theft. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. America panicked, fearing it had fallen behind in science and technology. Result was the space race. NASA was created. Education and research funding soared. In 1969, the U.S. put the first man on the moon, a huge Cold War victory. Life at home during the Cold War? Back in the U.S., anti-communism became a national obsession. Senator Joseph McCarthy led a campaign to root out alleged communists in the government, Hollywood, and universities. Thousands were blacklisted, questioned, and fired, often without evidence. It was called McCarthyism, and it created a climate of paranoia and fear. Meanwhile, the 1950s saw a booming middle class, suburban growth, and the birth of consumer culture. Under the surface, Americans began to question conformity and demand justice. The Cold War heats up. By the early 1960s, the world came dangerously close to nuclear war. In 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade demanding their removal. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Finally, the Soviets backed down, agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it nearly ended the world. Divided world, a divided nation. The Cold War shaped everything: foreign policy, culture, education, technology. It led to proxy wars, coups, scientific breakthroughs, and cultural revolutions. But the Cold War also divided the world and divided Americans. As the U.S. fought communism abroad, people at home began demanding equality, justice, and change. Part 31. The Civil Rights Movement. Marching toward justice. While the United States battled communism abroad, millions of Americans at home faced a different kind of war. A war against racism, segregation, and injustice. For Black Americans, the promises of freedom and equality had never been fully realized. Even after the Civil War and Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws in the South upheld segregation, voter suppression, and second-class citizenship. But beginning in the 1950s, a new generation of activists rose up to say, enough. Brown v. Board of Education. The legal foundation of segregation was shaken in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate but equal is *** inherently unequal. The decision called for the desegregation of public schools across the country. But in many places, especially the Deep South, white resistance was fierce. Little Rock 9. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 Black students attempted to integrate Central High School. They were met with angry mobs and National Guard troops blocking their entry. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce the law and protect the students. It was a powerful signal. The federal government would no longer ignore civil rights. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. Her arrest sparked a year-long boycott of the city's bus system, led by a young pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was a non-violent movement. Rooted in Christian values, Gandhian principles, and strategic protest, the boycott succeeded. The buses were desegregated. King became the face of a growing movement. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and direct action. Throughout the 1960s, civil rights activists used nonviolent protests to challenge segregation. Sit-ins at all-white lunch counters, freedom rides, where integrated groups rode buses into the segregated South. Voter registration drives in hostile towns and counties. Many were beaten, jailed, killed, but they kept going. The March on Washington. In 1963, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., for a peaceful protest demanding civil and economic rights. It was here that Dr. King gave his iconic speech, "I Have a Dream." He dreamed of a nation where people were judged not by their skin color, but by the content of their character. Civil rights legislation. Under pressure from the movement and public opinion, Washington finally acted. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected Black Americans' right to vote by outlawing literacy tests and other racist barriers. These were landmark victories, but the struggle was far from over. Urban riots and radical voices. As the 1960s progressed, frustrations grew. In cities like Watts, Detroit, and Newark, riots broke out over poverty, police brutality, and inequality. A new generation of activists emerged. Malcolm X preached Black self-reliance and pride. Groups like the Black Panther Party demanded community defense and an end to police violence. Some rejected nonviolence, arguing that freedom must be taken, not asked for. The movement was evolving, more diverse, more urgent, more militant. The assassinations. Tragedy struck the heart of the movement. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Dr. King was gunned down in 1968 in Memphis. Robert F. Kennedy, a supporter of civil rights, was also killed that same year. America entered a period of grief and unrest. But the seeds of change had been planted. The legacy of the movement, civil rights movement, transformed the nation. Segregation laws fell. Voting rights expanded. Black culture and voices took center stage in American life. Though racism didn't disappear, the movement redefined the moral foundation of the country. It taught generations to speak up, to organize, to demand justice. Part 32. Vietnam, Watergate, and a crisis of confidence. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, America stood at a crossroads. The victories of the civil rights movement were historic, but the nation was now caught in a storm of war, political scandal, and cultural upheaval. The dream of post-war optimism was unraveling, and Americans were beginning to lose faith in their leaders, their government, and even their future. The Vietnam War, a long, costly conflict. It started slowly in the 1950s, escalated in the 1960s, and by the early 1970s, Vietnam had become America's longest war. The U.S. had entered Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, following its Cold War strategy of containment. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were deployed. But victory never came. Jungles were dense. Enemies were hidden. The Viet Cong fought a guerrilla war, blending into villages and terrain. American soldiers faced booby traps, ambushes, and a growing sense of futility. The home front turns against the war. At home, public support collapsed. Images of burned villages, wounded soldiers, and dead civilians appeared on television night after night. The Tet Offensive in 1968, though a military failure for the North Vietnamese, shattered the illusion that America was winning. Young people protested in the streets. College campuses erupted in demonstrations. Draft cards were burned. Chants of "Hell no, we won't go" echoed across the nation. Then came My Lai massacre of over 500 Vietnamese civilians by U.S. troops, and the Pentagon Papers, a leaked government report showing that leaders had lied about the war's progress. Trust in the government was crumbling. Kent State and cultural division. And in 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on anti-war protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students. It was a chilling moment. The country wasn't just divided by race, class, or generation. It was now divided by war, fear, and ideology. The counterculture of the 1960s bled into the 1970s. Young people rejected traditional norms, braced free expression, psychedelic music, and anti-establishment values. But while some sought peace and change, others feared chaos and collapse. Watergate, the presidency on trial. As the war dragged on, a new scandal rocked the nation. In 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. What seemed like a small crime slowly unraveled into a massive cover-up, led by none other than the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Through tapes, testimony, and investigation, it became clear. Nixon had tried to obstruct justice, silence the press, and abuse his power. In 1974, facing impeachment and certain removal, Nixon resigned. He became the first U.S. president to ever do so. Vice President Gerald Ford took office and soon after pardoned Nixon, further deepening public anger. A nation in decline. Died by the mid-1970s, Americans were exhausted. The economy had stalled with inflation, unemployment, and long gas lines. Trust in institutions was at a historic low. The U.S. had lost the Vietnam War, withdrawing in 1975 as North Vietnamese forces took Saigon. President Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, spoke openly about the nation's crisis of confidence. Americans no longer felt their country was on the right track, but not the end. Yet even in this period of disillusionment, something important was happening. People were becoming more politically engaged. New movements for environmentalism, women's rights, and LGBTQ equality began to grow, and America, as always, would eventually reinvent itself. The country had hit rock bottom, but from that low point, it was about to undergo a political revolution. Part 33. The Reagan Era and the End of the Cold War. As the 1980s began, America was hungry for a comeback. After years of war, scandal, and economic struggle, many Americans were tired of feeling weak, tired of inflation, tired of rising crime, tired of global uncertainty. They wanted strength. They wanted clarity. They wanted someone who would make them feel proud again. In 1980, they chose a former actor, California governor, and staunch conservative, Ronald Reagan. Morning in America. Ronald Reagan's message was simple but powerful. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. He promised tax cuts, deregulation, military strength, and a return to American values. The nation responded. Reagan won in a landslide. and his presidency launched what became known as the Reagan Revolution, Reaganomics, and the conservative wave. At home, Reagan's policies focused on stimulating the economy through supply-side economics, nicknamed Reaganomics. The core ideas: cut taxes especially for the wealthy and corporations, reduce government spending, deregulate industries to promote business growth. Supporters said it revived the economy and boosted confidence. Critics argued it increased inequality and exploded the national debt. Still, Reagan's charm, communication skills, and optimism won over much of the country. He was called the Great Communicator. The Cold War heats up again. Reagan took a hard line against the Soviet Union. He called it an evil empire. He expanded U.S. defense spending dramatically. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, futuristic missile defense system critics called Star Wars. The arms race was back on. But so was something else: a shift in the Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev in a new era. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader. He introduced bold reforms: glasnost, openness and freedom of speech, perestroika, economic restructuring. Gorbachev knew the Soviet system was failing. He wanted to change it, not destroy it. Reagan and Gorbachev held historic summits, slowly thawing relations. In 1987, Reagan stood at the Berlin Wall and issued a challenge: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The wall falls, and the Cold War ends. In 1989, just 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds of East and West Berliners tore it down together, a stunning symbol of unity and freedom. Communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War was over. America had won not with bombs, but with persistence, principles, and economic might. The U.S. emerged as the sole global superpower. Complex legacy. Reagan left office in 1989 with high approval. His presidency energized the right, shifted the political landscape, and redefined America's role in the world. But his legacy was also controversial. His administration faced scandals, like the Iran-Contra affair, in which weapons were secretly sold to Iran to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. His economic policies helped the wealthy far more than the poor. The AIDS epidemic ravaged communities, especially LGBTQ+ ones, while the federal response lagged. Even so, Reagan reshaped American politics, and his vision of a smaller government, stronger military, and prouder national identity endured for decades. Part 34. The 1990s. Prosperity, politics, and the digital revolution. The Cold War had ended. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was gone as the 1990s began. America stood alone as the world's sole superpower, confident, wealthy, and ready for a new era. It was a time of booming technology, cultural shifts, and global influence. But beneath the surface, America was entering a new kind of struggle, one that wasn't about tanks and missiles, but about identity, information, and power in a rapidly changing world. Desert Storm and a new global role. The decade began with war. In 1990, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait's small, oil-rich neighbor. President George H.W. Bush, leading a global coalition, launched Operation Desert Storm to drive Iraq out. In just 6 weeks, U.S.-led forces achieved a swift victory, with minimal American casualties. It was seen as a success. America was reaffirming its power in the post-Cold War world. But Hussein remained in power, and the Middle East would stay unstable, a storm brewing for years to come. Bill Clinton and the politics of the center. In 1992, Democrat Bill Clinton defeated Bush, promising a fresh start. He represented a new generation, young, charismatic, and pragmatic. Clinton governed as a centrist. He embraced free trade and signed NAFTA, linking the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in an economic pact. The economy soared. The 1990s saw low unemployment, low inflation, and a tech-driven boom. For the first time in decades, the U.S. ran a budget surplus. But Clinton's presidency was also defined by controversy, scandal, and impeachment. In 1998, Clinton faced impeachment not over policy, but over personal behavior. After denying an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, he later admitted to misleading the public and Congress. He was impeached by the House, but acquitted by the Senate, remaining in office. The scandal revealed growing divides between public morality and political power, between partisanship and governance, between the media's role and personal privacy. The digital revolution begins. While politics played out in Washington, something world-changing was happening elsewhere, something that would redefine daily life. The Internet. In the 1990s, personal computers became common. Email and the World Wide Web revolutionized communication. Startups like Yahoo, eBay, and Amazon were born. Silicon Valley boomed. Dot-com companies exploded in value, many without making a single dollar in profit. This was the dawn of the information age. The U.S. was no longer just an industrial power. It was becoming a digital empire, culture in conflict. The 1990s were also a time of cultural change and rising tensions. Multiculturalism became a national conversation. Hip-hop, grunge, and pop music reshaped American sound. LGBTQ+ rights began gaining ground, though discrimination persisted. Mass shootings, like at Columbine High School, shocked the nation and sparked debates on gun control internationally. America intervened in humanitarian crises in Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans, trying to balance its role as a global peacekeeper. Terrorism emerges. In 1993, terrorists bombed the World Trade Center in New York, killing 6 and injuring over 1,000. It was an early warning. By the end of the decade, name began to circulate in intelligence circles. Osama bin Laden, leader of a group called Al-Qaeda. Though most Americans hadn't heard of him yet, he was already planning something that would change everything. The end of the decade, the edge of a new era. The 1990s closed with hope and anxiety. Technology was racing forward. America was the global leader. But beneath the optimism lay instability, economic bubbles, cultural polarization, and new threats lurking in the shadows. In 2000, the presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore would be one of the most controversial in U.S. history. And just 1 year later, America would face a day that would define a generation. Part 35. 9/11ths and the War on Terror. It was a clear September morning. Ordinary, quiet, peaceful. Then, at 8:46 a.m., everything changed. Hijacked plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, another plane struck the South Tower. Soon after, a third slammed into the Pentagon. And a fourth, United Flight 93, crashed in a Pennsylvania field, brought down by brave passengers who fought back. It was September 11th, 2001, the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. A nation in shock. Nearly 3,000 people died that day. Office workers, firefighters, flight attendants, mothers, fathers, children, the twin. Towers collapsed into clouds of ash and steel. New York was transformed into a war zone. The Pentagon burned, and the entire country stood paralyzed watching it unfold on live TV. President George W. Bush addressed the nation that night. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. The enemy was soon named Al-Qaeda, an extremist Islamic terror network led by Osama bin Laden. The war on terror begins. The U.S. demanded the Taliban government in Afghanistan hand over bin Laden. They refused. October 7, 2001, America launched Operation Enduring Freedom. U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan to destroy Al-Qaeda, overthrow the Taliban, prevent future terrorist attacks. The war was swift at first. The Taliban fell within weeks, but bin Laden escaped, and the conflict dragged on. It became America's longest war. Homeland security and civil liberties. Back home, the U.S. mobilized like never before. The Department of Homeland Security was created. Airport security tightened dramatically. The Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers. The line between security and freedom grew thinner. Muslims and Middle Eastern Americans faced discrimination, hate crimes, and suspicion. Fear had changed America, and the fear was far from over. The invasion of Iraq. In 2003, the Bush administration claimed that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Despite international skepticism, America invaded Iraq. Baghdad fell quickly. Hussein was captured and later executed. But no WMDs were ever found. What followed was insurgency, civil war, and years of chaos. Thousands of U.S. troops were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians died. The invasion damaged America's global reputation and deepened political divisions at home, the longest war. Back in Afghanistan, the war dragged on. New strategies, more troops, more deaths, spanned 4 presidencies: Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. In 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs finally located and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It was a moment of justice in years in the making. But victory in Afghanistan never came. In 2021, the U.S. withdrew completely. The Taliban, 20 years after being ousted, returned to power almost instantly. It raised painful questions. What had it all been for? Has anything truly changed? Legacy of 9/11s? The attacks of September 11th shaped an entire generation. Children grew up with war as a constant. Surveillance became a new normal. Terror threats, airport checks, and military deployments became daily realities. And the wars left behind wounded veterans, PTSD, billions in costs, and a country that felt both safer and more uncertain than ever. Part 36. The 2010s. Division, social media, the rise of Trump. The 2010s began with hope and uncertainty. The Great Recession had scarred the economy, as the nation was still at war overseas. But a new president had taken office, one who promised change, healing, and a new American story. In 2008, Barack Obama made history, became the first black president of the United States. A former community organizer and senator from Illinois, his campaign ignited young people, inspired voters of color, and revived global goodwill. But as he entered office, he also stepped into a deeply divided nation. The Obama presidency. President Obama's early years were defined by crisis, signed a massive economic stimulus to pull the country out of recession. He passed the Affordable Care Act, expanding healthcare access to millions. He rescued the automotive industry and stabilized the banking system. He also ordered the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. But opposition to his presidency was fierce and relentless. The rise of the Tea Party, a conservative grassroots movement, accused Obama of government overreach and stoked racial and political resentment. His presidency exposed a hard truth. Even as America made progress, its divides ran deep politically, racially, economically. Social media and the new public square. Meanwhile, technology was changing everything. In the 2010s, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube became the new town halls. Ideas spread instantly. Movements formed overnight. Everyone had a voice and a camera. Social media helped launch powerful movements. Black Lives Matter began in 2013 after the killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his shooter. #MoToo went viral, calling out sexual harassment and abuse. Climate strikes, protests, and viral activism swept across screens and streets. But these platforms also fueled misinformation, division, and rage. Echo chambers hardened. Conspiracies thrived. Truth itself began to fracture. Cultural and political tensions. The 2010s saw cultural shifts accelerate. LGBTQ+ rights expanded, culminating in the 2015 Supreme Court ruling that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Conversations on race, gender, and identity became more central and more contentious. Traditional norms were being challenged, redefined, or outright rejected. This era produced both empowerment and backlash. While progressives pushed for social change, many Americans, especially in rural and working-class communities, felt ignored, mocked, and left behind. Economic inequality widened. Factories closed. Opioid addiction surged. Discontent simmered beneath the surface. The 2016 earthquake. Donald Trump. Then, in 2016, something happened few predicted. Donald J. Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star, and he had no political experience. He broke every rule of campaign decorum. He insulted rivals, mocked reporters, and vowed to make America great again. And he won. He defeated Democrat Hillary Clinton in a stunning upset, despite losing the popular vote. Trump's rise exposed the depth of distrust in government, rural and industrial despair, anger at elites and media, and a growing divide between urban liberalism and traditional conservatism. The Trump presidency, shockwaves and showdowns. Donald Trump's presidency was unlike any other. Every day brought tweets, controversies, and headlines. His policies pleased many conservatives. Massive tax cuts, deregulation, appointment of 3 Supreme Court justices, a hardline stance on immigration and trade. But his rhetoric was divisive. He called the media the enemy of the people. He downplayed climate change. He was impeached twice. The first, in 2019, was over a phone call pressuring Ukraine to investigate a political rival. He was acquitted. Still, his base was fiercely loyal. To supporters, Trump was a fighter against the swamp, the media, and the status quo. To critics, he was a threat to institutions, truth, and democracy itself, a nation divided. By the end of the 2010s, America was fractured. Red versus blue, rural versus urban, globalist versus nationalist, old America versus new America. Social trust declined, citizenship hardened. And then, on the edge of a new decade, a global crisis would bring everything to a boil. Part 37. Pandemic Protest. The Battle for America's Soul. The 2020s began not with celebration, but with a crisis. A new virus was spreading across the globe, invisible, contagious, deadly, in just weeks. It turned crowded cities into ghost towns, overwhelmed hospitals, and claimed lives on a scale not seen in a century. It was called COVID-19, and it would reshape everything. The pandemic hits. In early 2020, COVID-19 reached America. Lockdowns began. Businesses closed. Flights were grounded. Schools went remote. The economy collapsed almost overnight. Tens of millions lost their jobs. Grocery store shelves emptied. And over time, more than 1 million Americans would die. Doctors and nurses fought to save lives with limited equipment. Scientists raced for a vaccine. And Americans. About masks. About lockdowns. About vaccines. Even a global health emergency became political. The George Floyd protests. Then came another flashpoint. On May 25, 2020, a black man named George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. Kneeling on his neck for over 9 minutes, the officer ignored Floyd's cries, "I can't breathe." The video went viral, and the country erupted. Millions took to the streets across all 50 states and around the world. The Black Lives Matter movement reached new heights. Demands for racial justice, police reform, and equality filled the air, but so did tear gas, clashes, and political firestorms. Cities burned, statues fell. America was in the middle of a reckoning. The 2020 election. Amid pandemic, protest, and unrest, a deeply divided nation headed into the 2020 presidential election. The challenger, Joe Biden, former vice president and lifelong Democrat. The incumbent, Donald Trump, seeking re-election amid crisis. The campaign was like no other. Virtual rallies, mail-in voting, bitter debates, accusations of fraud. In November 2020, Joe Biden won by over 7 million votes and a strong electoral college margin. But Trump and many of his supporters refused to accept the results. January 6th, the Capitol insurrection. On January 6, 2021, as Congress met to certify the election, a mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, waving flags, breaking windows, clashing with police. Some chanted about hanging the vice president. Others wandered the halls of Congress, searching for lawmakers. It was the first time the Capitol had been breached since 1814. The world watched in disbelief. 5 people died. Dozens were injured. Hundreds were arrested. It was a direct assault on democracy fueled by conspiracy, rage, and misinformation. A nation in conflict. President Biden took office 2 weeks later under heavy guard and behind fences. He promised to heal a broken country. But healing would be hard. The 2020s had revealed just how deep America's divisions ran. Political polarization at its peak. Mistrust in elections, science, and institutions. A growing gap between truth and fiction. And a society increasingly fractured by class, race, geography, and information bubbles. Hope in the storm. Yet even in the chaos, signs of resilience appeared. Vaccines were developed in record time. Millions volunteered, donated, and protested for change. Young people organized, voted, and made their voices heard. Artists, creators, and everyday citizens shared stories of hope, grief, and survival. America was hurting, yes, but it was still fighting. Fighting to live, fighting to matter, fighting to become, once again, the country it claimed to be. Part 38. America Today. Division, Innovation, and the Fight for the Future. Here we are in the present. The history of the United States has been long, violent, triumphant, conflicted, beautiful, and brutal. And now, in the 2020s, the country stands at a crossroads once again. This is a nation built on contradiction, freedom and oppression, unity and division. And today, those contradictions are more visibly and more urgent than ever. A divided democracy. The United States is deeply polarized. Red versus blue, urban versus rural, nationalist vs. globalist, progressive versus conservative, every issue, whether it's climate, guns, gender, race, or religion feels like a battle. The media landscape is fractured. Disinformation spreads like wildfire, and many Americans live in entirely separate realities. Elections are now surrounded by fear, distrust, and legal battles. Even the peaceful transfer of power once sacred has become fragile. The culture wars. Beneath politics lies a cultural struggle over what it means to be American, over who gets to belong, over how we define history, identity, and truth. Debates over critical race theory, trans rights, books in schools, and historical monuments dominate headlines. Cancel culture, wokeness, traditional values, freedom of speech. These aren't just words anymore. They're flashpoints in a growing identity crisis. The climate clock is ticking. At the same time, the planet is changing fast. Wildfires rage across the West. Hurricanes devastate the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. Heat waves, floods, and droughts grow more intense each year. The U.S. remains one of the largest contributors to carbon emissions, but also a leader in climate innovation. Solar, wind, electric vehicles, green infrastructure. The climate fight is no longer theoretical. It's now a matter of survival for the world, and for America's place within it. A technological superstorm. We now live in a world where artificial intelligence can write, speak, and even think. Social media algorithms shape beliefs, elections, and mental health. Surveillance is everywhere. Privacy is a memory. The United States leads the world in tech innovation, but also struggles with the consequences of that innovation. Mental health crises, digital addiction, online radicalization, job loss due to automation. The tools we created to connect us now have the power to control us. Social movements and new generations. But America's next generation is rising. They are more diverse than ever before, more connected than any in history, and more vocal about climate, justice, equality, and change. Movements like March for Our Lives, Sunrise Movement, #Mo2, and #BLM continue to shape the public conversation. These young voices demand a future better than the past even, as they inherit its wounds. Immigration, innovation, and global power. America remains a beacon for immigrants, innovators, and dreamers. It leads in space exploration with private companies like SpaceX, launching rockets and planning for Mars. It dominates entertainment, from Hollywood to YouTube to TikTok. It still possesses unmatched military power, scientific leadership, and cultural influence. But its place in the world is being challenged. Rising powers like China and a resurgent Russia pose threats and alternatives. Allies question U.S. reliability, and at home, Americans question what kind of global role they want to play. The American experiment continues. America has never been perfect, but it was never meant to be. It is a living experiment in freedom, in pluralism, in the idea that out of many, one can emerge. Today, that experiment is being tested perhaps more than at any point since the Civil War. Will it hold? Will Americans find common ground? Or will the Union fracture under the weight of its own contradictions? The answer, as always, is unwritten. Part 39. the future of the United States. Scenarios, challenges, and possibilities. So far, we've walked through over 400 years of American history, from the first settlers and revolutionaries to the Civil War. World wars, civil rights, and digital revolutions. From triumph to tragedy, progress to pain. Now we turn toward the most uncertain chapter of all, the future. What comes next for the United States of America? No one knows for sure. But we can glimpse the road ahead through the challenges, choices, and possibilities now taking shape. Scenario 1. A nation divided. If current trends continue, America may become even more polarized. Political compromise could collapse entirely. State governments may diverge into parallel legal systems, each reflecting opposing ideologies. Red states pass strict abortion bans, gun laws, and anti-immigration measures. Blue states strengthen LGBTQ rights, green energy, and universal health care programs. In this scenario, the federal government weakens, and the country begins to function like two nations within one border. Social trust continues to erode. Misinformation thrives. And faith in democracy, once a unifying ideal, fades into suspicion and fear. Scenario 2. Reform and renewal. But history is never just destiny. It's also choice. America has reinvented itself many times before. This could be one of those moments. New generations, empowered by digital tools, could reshape the system. Electoral reform to end gerrymandering and increase voter access. Campaign finance reform to reduce corporate influence. Community-driven solutions to bridge divides at the local level. If citizens re-engage across race, region, and class, there's a chance to rebuild. A stronger democracy, a fairer economy, deeper national unity. Scenario 3. Technological transformation. In another possible future, technology defines everything. Artificial intelligence transforms work, medicine, warfare, and creativity. Automation replaces millions of jobs, but also creates entirely new industries. The U.S. could become a leader in green energy, space exploration, neurotechnology, and digital democracy. But it could also become a surveillance state where privacy vanishes and corporate algorithms shape every decision. The line between citizen and data point may become impossible to see. Scenario 4. Climate collapse or climate leadership. The climate crisis will define this century. In one path, America fails to act. Rising seas swamp cities like Miami and New York. Wildfires make entire regions unlivable. Food and water shortages spark mass migration and economic collapse. But on another path, America could lead a green revolution, powering its economy with clean energy, exporting technology to the world, creating millions of sustainable jobs, and fulfilling its role as global steward, not just superpower. Scenario 5. A more perfect union. The most hopeful future may not be the most flashy. It may simply be a country that slowly, steadily does better, where voters trust elections again, where truth matters more than tribe, where equality under the law becomes a lived reality, where history is taught honestly, not weaponized, and where liberty, justice, and community aren't slogans but shared responsibilities. It won't be easy, and it won't be perfect. But then again, America never was. A country still becoming. The United States has always been a story in motion, a nation born not just of geography, but of ideas, democracy, freedom, justice, self-governance. Those ideas have often been betrayed, but never abandoned. The real strength of America is not that it's finished, but that it can still be changed. The chapters of conquest, revolution, slavery, immigration, war, invention, protest, and perseverance are not just history. They are instructions. Part 40, Final Reflection. What we've learned from the entire history of the United States. We've now traveled through centuries, from dusty colonial outposts to industrial skylines, from battlefields soaked in blood to rockets soaring toward the stars. We've followed the story of a nation built on dreams, fueled by contradictions, and still searching for its truest self. This is not just a history of the United States, It's a history of human ambition, struggle, and reinvention. So, what have we learned? Lesson 1. Power always has a price. From the beginning, America has been a land of immense power. Political power, military power, economic power, cultural power. But every rise has come with a cost. The freedom of some built on the backs of slaves. The conquest of land brought the destruction of indigenous peoples. The pursuit of global leadership led to endless wars, both cold and hot. Power without justice breeds resistance. And history has shown repeatedly how the oppressed have always found ways to fight back. Lesson 2. Democracy is fragile. The American experiment was never guaranteed. It almost collapsed in the Civil War. It cracked during the Great Depression. It was tested by Watergate, 9/11s, and January 6th. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires participation, honesty, and accountability. Without those, it becomes hollow or worse, dangerous. Every generation has had to defend it, and this one is no exception. Lesson 3. Progress is not a straight line. America's story is not a simple march toward justice. It is zigzagged. It is filled with setbacks, reversals, and revolutions. Slavery ended, but racism did not. Women gained the vote, but not full equality. LGBTQ+ Americans fought for marriage, but still faced discrimination. Immigrants shaped the nation while being scapegoated throughout it. Yet still, step by step, progress has come, not as a gift, but as something won. Lesson 4. The people make the nation. Presidents and generals get the headlines. But the real story of America has always been its people. The enslaved who escaped and resisted. The factory workers who unionized. The suffragists who marched. The scientists, poets, teachers, soldiers, and dreamers. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This country has never belonged to the few at the top. It belongs to those who show up, speak out, and build something better. Lesson 5. The story isn't over. History is not the past. It's the context for the present. It's the compass for the future. America is still becoming. Every law passed, every protest held, every election voted in, continues that becoming. And you, yes, you listening now, are part of that story. The final thought. The United States of America is not a perfect nation, but it is a persistent one. It fails and it fights, falls and it rises. It forgets, and sometimes painfully it remembers. It is capable of cruelty, but also astonishing courage. And if there is one constant in all this time, it is this. America changes, not easily, not always for the better, but it can. And that's why its story still matters. Not because it is finished, but because it is unfinished. And the next chapter is up to us. Thank you for watching the entire history of the United States of America, only on Shadow Theory. If this journey moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, like, subscribe. And share this with others who seek to understand not just history, but the meaning behind it. Yes, the past is not dead. It's not even past. And the future begins now.